Hello there, bored people. Whether you're listening from beneath weighted blankets in Berlin, curled up in a corner cafe in Cairo, or walking empty streets at 3 a.m. somewhere between exhaustion and wonder, you've found your way to the right place. Let your shoulders drop, let the day's noise fade just a little. Tonight we're travelling back through time, not with fanfare or dramatic music, but slowly, thoughtfully, the way stories deserve to be told. This is a space for long-form, evidence-based exploration, a place where we follow the threads of human history, not through conquest or kings, but through the quiet moments that changed everything. The moments when someone first looked at wild grass and wondered, what if? When communities decided to stay instead of wander. When our species took a turn that would reshape not just how we lived, but who we became. If you find this kind of gentle, fact-based storytelling helpful, whether it helps you drift towards sleep, focus on work, or simply slow down in a world that rarely pauses, consider leaving a like and subscribing. That small gesture helps other curious minds discover this corner of thoughtful content. And if you'd like, tell us in the comments how you use these stories. Are you listening before bed, during a long commute, while staring out a window somewhere on the other side of the planet? There are also timestamps in the description, so if you happen to drift off, and there's no shame in that, you can pick up tomorrow, right where the story left you, because this tale, from beginning to end, is worth following all the way through. So settle in, breathe. Let your mind wander backward with me, past cities and civilizations, past the invention of writing, past the first pyramids and temples, all the way back to a world that would be almost unrecognizable to us now. A world where no human had ever planted a seed on purpose, where no one owned land because the very concept didn't exist, where our ancestors moved with the seasons, like rivers following their courses, carrying everything they needed in their hands and their memories. Tonight, we're asking one of the most profound questions in human history. Was the invention of farming our greatest achievement, or our most catastrophic mistake? And to answer that, we need to understand what we were before we became farmers, what we lost, what we gained, and why, once we started down this path, there may have been no turning back. This is the story of how farming made us, or perhaps how it unmade us. Let's begin at the beginning, in a world where the horizon was always home. 20,000 years ago, if you could somehow visit our planet, you would find a world locked in ice and silence. Glaciers stretched across continents like frozen seas, grinding mountains into valleys and reshaping the very bones of the earth. Much of northern Europe and North America lay buried beneath ice sheets, kilometers thick. Sea levels had dropped so dramatically that entire continents were connected by land bridges that no longer exist. But this was not a dead world. It was a world in motion, full of life that had learned to thrive in the spaces between ice and stone. And walking through this landscape, following game trails and river valleys, reading the language of seasons written in bird migrations and flowering plants, were our ancestors. Not cave-dwelling brutes from old cartoons, but people as intelligent and capable as anyone alive today. They just lived differently, completely differently. These were the last great hunter-gatherers, and they inhabited a world that operated by rules we've almost entirely forgotten. Food wasn't grown in rows or stored in silos. It was found, gathered, hunted, shared. Knowledge wasn't written in books, but carried in memory, passed from grandmother to grandchild, through stories, songs, and the patient teaching of hands. Wealth wasn't accumulated in bank accounts, but expressed in relationships, in knowing who owed whom a favour, in the complex web of obligations and gifts that held communities together. They moved constantly, but their movement wasn't random wandering, it was choreographed by deep understanding of the land. They knew which valleys would flood in spring, which hillsides would be rich with berries in late summer, which coastal areas would teem with shellfish during particular tides. Their calendar wasn't marked by numbers but by the behaviour of animals, the changing colours of leaves, the angle of sunlight through trees. This mobility was their greatest strength. When resources became scarce in one area, they could move to another. When conflict arose between groups, space itself provided the solution. Someone could simply walk away. When the weather turned harsh or game grew scarce, they could follow better conditions across vast distances. They were, in many ways, perfectly adapted to a world of constant change. Their diets were extraordinarily diverse. Modern nutritional studies of contemporary hunter-gatherer societies suggest they often consumed hundreds of different plant and animal species throughout the year. Where we might eat a dozen different foods in a typical week, they might eat 50. Their meals included everything from large game like mammoths and bison to tiny seeds, nuts, roots, berries, fish, shellfish, insects, and plants we've forgotten are edible. This dietary diversity wasn't just nutritionally superior to what came later, it was also a form of insurance. If one food source failed, dozens of others remained. If the salmon didn't run one year, there were still deer to hunt, nuts to gather, roots to dig. Their survival never depended on a single species or strategy. Their social structures were fluid and egalitarian in ways that would seem almost impossible to us now. Leadership was situational. The best tracker might lead during a hunt. The most experienced elder might guide decisions about when to move camp. The most skilled negotiator might handle disputes. But these roles shifted based on circumstances and expertise. No one person held permanent power over others. Sharing was not just customary, but essential. Sharing, in a world where tomorrow's meal was never guaranteed, hoarding resources was not just antisocial, it was dangerous. If you refused to share your successful hunt today, you might find yourself excluded from others' good fortune tomorrow. This created powerful incentives for cooperation and generosity that anthropologists call demand sharing, the expectation that anyone with surplus would distribute it to those in need. Children grew up not in nuclear families, but in extended networks of relatives and community members. Everyone helped raise everyone else's children. Knowledge was shared freely because the survival of the group depended on everyone having access to essential skills. There were no schools, but learning was constant and embedded in daily life. Their relationship with the natural world was fundamentally different from ours. They didn't see themselves as separate from nature or as its masters. They were part of it, participants in its cycles rather than controllers of its processes. They knew the individual trees in their territory, the habits of specific animal herds, the subtle signs that indicated weather changes days in advance. This intimate knowledge extended to an understanding of ecological relationships that we're only beginning to rediscover. They knew which plants grew well together, how to use fire to encourage the growth of desired species, how to harvest in ways that actually increased future abundance rather than depleting it. They were, in effect, ecosystem managers, but managers who worked with natural processes rather than against them. 2. They also understood something we've largely forgotten, that scarcity was often temporary and local. If resources were scarce here, they were probably abundant somewhere else. If this year was difficult, next year might be better. Their response to shortage was not to intensify extraction from a small area, but to expand their search across a larger one. This lifestyle required extraordinary skill and knowledge. A successful hunter-gatherer needed to be part botanist, part zoologist, part meteorologist, part physician, part diplomat, and part artist. They needed to read tracks in mud, predict weather from cloud formations, identify hundreds of plants and their uses, understand animal behaviour patterns, navigate vast distances without maps, and maintain complex social relationships across multiple groups. They were also remarkably healthy by many measures. Their bones showed dense muscle attachments from constant physical activity, but relatively few signs of repetitive stress injuries. Their teeth, while worn from coarse foods, show less decay than their farming descendants. Their diets were rich in protein, fibre and micronutrients. They suffered from fewer infectious diseases because they lived in small mobile groups that rarely stayed in one place, long enough for pathogens to establish themselves. But perhaps most importantly, they were free in ways we can barely comprehend. Free from the tyranny of the clock, free from permanent debts or obligations, free from the anxiety of protecting accumulated possessions. Their wealth was their knowledge, their relationships, and their ability to move. And those forms of wealth couldn't be stolen, only shared. This was the world our species had inhabited for hundreds of thousands of years. It was the world that had shaped our bodies, our minds, our deepest instincts about fairness, cooperation, and survival. It was the world we were perfectly adapted to live in. And then gradually, quietly, in ways that seemed insignificant at the time, it began to change. Not through some sudden revolution or brilliant invention, but through small adjustments to old patterns. People began to return to the same gathering spots year after year. They started to notice that disturbed ground sometimes produced more of the plants they wanted. They began to stay in favourable locations a little longer than usual. These tiny shifts, innocent and practical, would eventually lead to the most profound transformation in human history. But the people making these changes had no idea where they were heading. They were simply doing what humans had always done, adapting to their circumstances, making the best decisions they could with the information they had. They couldn't have known that these small adjustments would eventually lock their descendants into a completely different way of life, that the flexibility and freedom their ancestors had enjoyed for millennia would gradually be traded away for something else entirely, that the world of mobility and sharing and intimate knowledge of vast landscapes would give way to a world of boundaries and ownership and intensive cultivation of small plots. The transformation was so gradual that no single generation experienced it as loss. Each small change seemed reasonable, even beneficial. Stay a little longer near the good fishing spot. Return to that productive grove. Next season, clear away some of the competing plants to help the useful ones grow better. Small steps, each one logical, each one leading inevitably to the next. But step by step, choice by choice, our ancestors were walking into a trap. Not a trap set by enemies or evil forces, but a trap inherent in the very logic of intensive resource use. A trap that, once sprung, would prove almost impossible to escape. The trap began with the weather, but not in the way you might expect, not with drought or flood or sudden catastrophe, but with something far more subtle and ultimately more dangerous: predictability. For hundreds of thousands of years, our ancestors had lived with climate as a moody, unpredictable force. Ice ages came and went like slow-breathing giants. Temperatures swung wildly across centuries. Rainfall patterns shifted without warning. Entire ecosystems could transform within a human lifetime. And our species had become extraordinarily good at riding these waves of change. But around 11,600 years ago, something unprecedented happened. The climate began to settle. The wild oscillations of the Ice Age gave way to something humans had never experienced before: stability. Temperatures evened out. Seasonal patterns became reliable. The chaotic pulses of glacial advance and retreat smoothed into the gentle rhythms we now call the Holocene. This climatic calm created new possibilities. For the first time in human memory, the rules of survival became predictable enough to bet on. You could count on spring arriving at roughly the same time each year. You could expect certain plants to ripen on schedule. You could plan for winter with reasonable confidence about what it would bring. In the hills and valleys of what we now call the Middle East, this newfound predictability began to interact with something else: an unusual abundance of wild grasses. Wheat, barley, and other cereals grew naturally across these landscapes in dense harvestable stands. Our ancestors had been gathering these grasses for thousands of years, but always as one resource among many, always as part of a broader strategy of movement and diversification. Now, with the climate stable enough to make predictions, some groups began to experiment with staying longer in areas where these grasses were particularly abundant. Not settling permanently, not yet, but lingering, returning to the same productive patches year after year, building more substantial shelters, investing more time and energy in processing and storing the seeds they gathered. This shift toward what archaeologists call intensification seemed entirely reasonable. Why walk 20 kilometres to find scattered patches of edible plants when there was plenty of food right here? Why rebuild your shelter from scratch each season when you could improve and maintain the one you already had? Why carry everything you owned when you knew you'd be back in this spot next year anyway? These decisions made perfect sense from the perspective of any individual family or band. They reduced labour, increased comfort, and provided more reliable access to abundant resources. But they also began to change the relationship between people and place in ways that were difficult to see at the time. The more time and energy people invested in a particular location, the harder it became to leave. Shelters became more elaborate. Storage facilities were built into the ground. Tools became larger and more specialised. Knowledge became increasingly focused on the specific characteristics of local resources rather than the general patterns that applied across vast territories. Most importantly, the act of intensive harvesting began to change the plants themselves. When people repeatedly gathered wild wheat, they naturally selected for stalks that held their seeds longer rather than scattering them immediately when ripe. They chose plants with larger seeds over those with smaller ones. They favoured grasses that ripened uniformly over those that matured at different times. These choices, made thousands of times by thousands of people over hundreds of generations, gradually altered the genetic makeup of the plants they depended on. The wild grasses slowly became less wild, more dependent on human intervention for their survival. And as the plants changed, so did the people who relied on them. The transformation was so gradual that no one noticed it happening. Each generation simply did what seemed most practical given their circumstances. But generation by generation, both humans and plants were being locked into an increasingly interdependent relationship. The people couldn't see that their new lifestyle was making them vulnerable in ways their mobile ancestors had never been. They couldn't predict that investing so heavily in one location would make it catastrophic to leave. They had no way of knowing that the plants they were unconsciously domesticating would eventually require year-round care, annual replanting, and constant protection from weeds and pests. They were making reasonable decisions based on immediate benefits, unaware that each choice was closing off options that had kept their ancestors free for hundreds of thousands of years. The trap wasn't malicious or intentional, it was simply the logical outcome of optimizing for short-term advantage without considering long-term consequences. Meanwhile, the very success of these intensive strategies began to support larger populations. When food became more predictable and abundant, families could afford to have more children. These children grew up knowing only the settled life, with no experience of the mobility that had been humanity's default for so long. To them, staying in one place wasn't a recent innovation, it was simply the way things were done. As populations grew, the pressure to maintain and expand food production increased. More mouths meant more grain needed. More grain meant more intensive cultivation. More intensive cultivation meant more labour, more specialisation, more investment in staying put. The cycle began to feed on itself, but the changes weren't just practical, they were psychological and social as well. When people began to invest heavily in particular places, those places began to acquire emotional and cultural significance that went far beyond their practical value. The grove where your grandmother was buried became sacred. The field your father had cleared became part of your identity. The storage pit your family had dug became something to defend. For the first time in human history, land began to be associated with ownership rather than just use. Not formal ownership, as we understand it today, but something more subtle. The sense that this place belonged to these people in ways that couldn't be easily transferred or shared. This shift in thinking about land created new forms of social tension. What happened when two groups claimed the same productive area? What happened when population growth pushed people into territories that others considered their own? What happened when the weather finally broke its pattern of reliability and some areas became more productive than others? The mobility that had once provided solutions to these problems was no longer available. When your survival depends on fields you've planted and storage facilities you've built, you can't simply walk away from conflict. You have to find other ways to resolve disputes, or you have to fight. Archaeological evidence from this period shows the first signs of what we might recognise as organised violence. Not the individual conflicts that had always occurred between humans, but coordinated attacks by groups on other groups. Mass graves containing dozens of individuals, all killed at roughly the same time. Settlements with defensive walls and hidden entrances. Weapons designed specifically for use against other humans, rather than for hunting animals. But even as these new pressures mounted, the benefits of the settled lifestyle continued to accumulate. People developed new technologies, new forms of art, new ways of organising their communities. They built the first permanent religious structures, created the first complex trade networks, developed the first systems for storing and transmitting knowledge across generations. They were becoming more sophisticated, more capable, more numerous, but they were also becoming more constrained, more vulnerable, more dependent on systems they couldn't easily abandon or replace. The trap was closing, but it was a trap baited with genuine advantages: better food, more comfortable shelter, larger communities, more complex culture. Each benefit made the lifestyle more attractive and more difficult to give up. Each innovation increased both capability and dependency in equal measure. By the time anyone might have recognised the full implications of what was happening, it was already too late to turn back. The knowledge needed for the old mobile lifestyle was being forgotten. The plants people depended on could no longer survive without human care. The populations had grown too large to be supported by hunting and gathering alone. The transformation was complete, irreversible, and largely invisible to the people living through it. They had traded the freedom of their ancestors for the security of settled life, not through a single dramatic decision, but through 10,000 small reasonable choices that had seemed to make perfect sense at the time. What they couldn't have known was that this trade would echo through every generation that followed, shaping not just how humans lived, but how they thought about themselves, their relationships with each other, and their place in the natural world. The seeds of civilization had been planted, but so had the seeds of inequality, environmental destruction, and a restless hunger for growth that would never again be satisfied. The first farmers had no word for what they were becoming, no concept that they were crossing a threshold from which there would be no return. They simply noticed that certain wild grasses seemed to grow better when the ground around them was disturbed, that seeds scattered near their camps sometimes sprouted into useful plants, that staying longer in places where food was abundant made more sense than wandering toward uncertainty. In the fertile valleys of the Levant, along the foothills of the Zagros Mountains, in the river basins of Anatolia, small groups began to experiment with encouraging the plants they already knew. Not farming as we imagine it, not neat rows or ploughed fields, but something gentler, more tentative, a conversation between human hands and wild seeds that had been going on for generations, but was now becoming something deeper. The plants they worked with were hardly impressive by modern standards. Early wheat was a scraggly grass with tiny seeds that shattered and scattered at the slightest touch. Wild barley grew in unpredictable patches, ripening unevenly, requiring patient gathering with primitive tools. These were not the golden waves of grain we associate with agriculture, but humble experiments in possibility. Yet something profound was happening in this partnership between people and plants. Each season, the humans naturally selected the best specimens, the stalks that held their seeds longer, the grasses with slightly larger grains, the plants that ripened at convenient times. They didn't understand genetics or evolution, but they were unconsciously guiding both. The plants, in turn, began to adapt to human preferences. Over hundreds of generations, wild wheat gradually developed tougher stems that didn't shatter when harvested. The seeds grew larger, more nutritious, more appealing to human taste. The timing of ripening became more synchronized, making harvest more efficient. It was evolution in real time, but so slow that no single human lifetime could perceive the change. This process took far longer than early archaeologists once imagined. The transformation from fully wild to recognizably domesticated plants required not decades, but millennia. 2,000 years, 3,000 years, timescales that dwarf entire civilizations, but mere moments in the deeper rhythm of human history. During this long transition, people weren't farmers in any sense we would recognize. They were still hunter-gatherers, but hunter-gatherers who had begun to hedge their bets. They continued to hunt wild game, to gather nuts and berries, to move seasonally between different resource zones, but increasingly they also tended their experimental plots, returned to productive areas at predictable times, and invested labour in activities that would pay off months or years in the future. The psychological shift was as important as the botanical one. For the first time in human history, people began to think systematically about tomorrow's meals rather than just today's. They developed mental calendars based on planting and harvesting cycles. They learned to defer gratification, to save seeds for planting rather than eating them all immediately. This required a new kind of discipline, a new relationship with desire and impulse. The mobile hunter-gatherer could eat whatever was available, when it was available, confident that tomorrow would bring new opportunities. The proto-farmer had to resist immediate consumption in favour of future possibility. They had to become planners, savers, investors in uncertain outcomes. The work was harder than most people realise. Preparing ground with stone tools was back-breaking labour. Protecting tender crops from birds, rodents, and competing plants required constant vigilance. Harvesting grain with flint sickles was slow, dangerous work that left hands cut and scarred. Processing the hard seeds into edible food involved hours of grinding on stone querns that wore down teeth and joints, and the returns were often disappointing. Wild plants that had evolved to survive without human help didn't always thrive under cultivation. Weather that seemed predictable could turn destructive without warning. Pests could destroy months of careful work in days. Storage techniques that worked for gathered food sometimes failed with the larger quantities that cultivation produced. Many experiments failed completely. Archaeological sites from this period show evidence of abandoned settlements, discontinued cultivation attempts, returns to purely mobile lifestyles. The transition to farming was not inevitable or irreversible, at least not at first. Many groups tried it and walked away. Others practiced it seasonally, while maintaining traditional hunting and gathering for most of their subsistence. But in certain places, under particular conditions, the experiment began to pay off. Areas with especially fertile soil, reliable water sources, and favourable climates saw the emergence of something new. Communities that were increasingly dependent on their cultivated plants, that stayed in one place for longer periods, that invested more and more of their labour in agricultural activities. These communities began to change in ways that went far beyond their food production methods. They built more substantial houses, not temporary shelters, but structures designed to last multiple seasons or even years. They developed more sophisticated storage techniques, creating sealed pits and raised platforms that could preserve grain through winter and beyond. They also began to accumulate possessions in ways their mobile ancestors never could. Heavier tools that would have been burdensome to carry became practical when you weren't constantly moving. Pottery, which had been virtually unknown among mobile groups, became common as people needed containers for storage, cooking, and processing their new foods. Population growth followed almost inevitably. When food became more predictable and abundant, families could support more children. The spacing between births decreased. Infant mortality, while still high by modern standards, may have been lower than among mobile groups who faced frequent food shortages and the dangers of constant travel. But more people meant more mouths to feed, which meant more pressure to expand and intensify cultivation. What had begun as a supplementary activity gradually became the foundation of survival. Communities found themselves locked into annual cycles of planting, tending, harvesting, and storing that left little time or energy for the diverse foraging strategies their ancestors had relied on. The knowledge began to change too. Where mobile hunter-gatherers had needed to know something about everything, hundreds of plant species, dozens of animal behaviours, navigation techniques, weather patterns across vast territories, the proto-farmers began to specialise. They knew their local plants extremely well, but lost familiarity with resources that lay beyond their immediate territory. This specialisation made them more efficient at food production, but more vulnerable to disruption. A mobile group could respond to local disasters by moving to unaffected areas. A settled community that had invested everything in a particular location had fewer options when things went wrong. Social relationships began to change as well. In mobile societies, disputes could often be resolved by separation. If people couldn't get along, they could join different bands or move to different territories. But when communities became tied to specific locations, to fields they had cleared and houses they had built, conflict had to be managed differently. New forms of leadership emerged, not the situational authority of mobile groups, but more permanent roles for people who could coordinate the complex activities of planting, harvesting and storage. Some individuals began to specialise in trade, travelling between settled communities to exchange surplus grain for obsidian, shells or other valued materials. The seeds of inequality were being planted alongside the grain. When food could be stored, it could also be hoarded. When some families were more successful at cultivation than others, those differences could persist and compound over generations. When special knowledge about timing, techniques, or trade relationships became valuable, those who possessed it gained advantages over those who didn't. But these changes were still subtle, still emerging. The early agricultural communities remained relatively egalitarian by later standards. The vast inequalities of wealth and power that would characterize later civilizations had not yet crystallized. People were still experimenting, still finding their way into a new form of human existence. What they couldn't have known was that each small step away from mobility, each increased investment in place-based resources, each generation born into settled life, was making the old way of living less accessible. The knowledge needed for successful hunting and gathering was being forgotten. The plants they depended on were becoming unable to survive without human care. The populations were growing beyond what the surrounding wild resources could support. The trap was closing gradually, gently, almost invisibly, not through conquest or coercion, but through the accumulated weight of countless small reasonable decisions. Each choice made sense in its immediate context. Each adaptation solved a pressing problem, but together they were weaving a web of dependency that would prove almost impossible to escape. The people living through this transformation experienced it not as loss but as improvement. They had more food, more comfortable shelters, larger communities, more sophisticated tools and techniques. Their lives were in many ways easier and more secure than those of their mobile ancestors. They couldn't see the full price of what they were gaining because that price would be paid by future generations. The environmental costs of intensive land use, the social costs of inequality and hierarchy, the psychological costs of being bound to place and routine, the spiritual costs of seeing themselves as separate from and dominant over the natural world rather than part of it. By the time these costs became apparent, the transformation would be complete and irreversible. Humanity would have crossed a threshold from which there could be no return. Not because the old way was impossible, but because the new way had made it impossible to remember how to live any other way. The greatest mistake, if it was a mistake, was not in choosing farming over hunting and gathering. It was in not understanding that the choice once made could not be unmade, that what began as a hedge against uncertainty would become the foundation of a completely new form of human existence, one that would reshape not just how people lived, but how they thought about themselves and their place in the world. The seeds were planted, the harvest was coming, and with it, everything we now call civilization, with all its wonders and all its sorrows. But the transformation wasn't happening in isolation. As these early experiments with cultivation spread across the fertile landscapes of the ancient world, something else was changing too, something that would prove just as revolutionary as the plants themselves. The animals were watching. For thousands of years, wild creatures had lived alongside human bands in a delicate dance of predator and prey, hunter and hunted. But as people began to settle into more predictable patterns, staying longer in favourable locations, building more substantial camps, some animals began to adjust their behaviour in response. Not all animals, most remained as wild and wary as they had always been. But a few species, those with the right combination of curiosity, adaptability, and social structure, began to linger at the edges of human settlements. Dogs had already made this transition much earlier, somewhere in the dim reaches of the Ice Age. But now other creatures began to follow a similar path. Wild boar crept closer to camps, drawn by food scraps and the disturbed ground, where edible roots might be more easily found. Wild cattle, massive and dangerous but also intelligent and social, began to tolerate human presence in ways their ancestors never had. And in the rocky highlands where early grain cultivation was taking hold, wild goats and sheep started to graze closer to human settlements, gradually losing their fear of bipedal neighbours. This wasn't domestication as we might imagine it. No one was deliberately breeding animals or keeping them in pens. It was something more gradual, more mutual, a slow negotiation between species, each getting something from the relationship, each gradually changing in response to the other's presence. The process began with garbage. Human settlements, even small ones, produced waste, food scraps, discarded materials, the detritus of daily life. For opportunistic animals, these refuse heaps represented easy meals, concentrated resources that required less energy to obtain than traditional foraging. The animals that could tolerate human noise, human smells, human unpredictability were the ones that gained access to this new ecological niche. Over generations, this tolerance was rewarded. The boldest, calmest animals fed better and reproduced more successfully than their skittish relatives. Their offspring inherited not just their genes, but their behavioural patterns, their comfort with human proximity. Gradually, these populations began to diverge from their wild cousins, not just in behaviour, but in physical characteristics as well. The changes were subtle at first, slightly smaller body size, as animals that didn't need to flee from predators as often could afford to be less athletically built. More varied coat colours and patterns, as the selective pressures that had favoured camouflage in the wild no longer applied as strongly. Changes in skull shape and brain size, as the complex environmental awareness needed for wild survival became less critical than the ability to read human intentions and moods. But the humans were changing too. As they began to recognise the benefits of having animals nearby, early warning systems for approaching predators, help with hunting, sources of meat that didn't require long, dangerous expeditions, they began to actively encourage the relationship. They started leaving food scraps in strategic locations, protecting favoured animals from predators, even beginning to intervene in breeding by preventing the most aggressive or unsuitable individuals from reproducing. This was the birth of animal husbandry, though it bore little resemblance to modern farming. There were no fences, no formal ownership, no systematic breeding programs. Instead, there was a loose partnership based on mutual benefit and growing interdependence. The animals received food, protection, and safety. The humans received meat, milk, labour, and companionship. The implications of this partnership extended far beyond simple protein production. Animals that lived closely with humans became sources of materials that couldn't be obtained any other way. Leather for clothing and containers, bone for tools and needles, sinew for thread and bowstrings. They provided manure that enriched the soil where crops were grown. They could carry heavy loads and help with the labour-intensive work of land clearance and cultivation. Perhaps most importantly, they represented a form of wealth that could walk itself to where it was needed. Unlike stored grain, which was vulnerable to rot, theft, and pest damage, livestock could be moved when necessary, could reproduce themselves, could even be traded or shared with other communities. They were, in effect, the first form of capital, productive assets that generated ongoing returns rather than just immediate consumption. But this new form of wealth came with new vulnerabilities. Animals could be stolen more easily than hidden grain stores. They required daily care, attention, and protection. They were vulnerable to disease, predation, and environmental disasters in ways that wild populations, with their genetic diversity and scattered distribution, were not. Most significantly, they tied their human partners even more firmly to specific locations and routines. Wild game could be hunted when and where it was found, but domestic animals needed to be fed, watered, and sheltered on a daily basis. They required pasture land, which meant defending territory. They needed protection from wild predators, which meant building enclosures and maintaining vigilance. The combination of crop cultivation and animal domestication created a new kind of human settlement, larger, more permanent, more complex than anything that had existed before. These early farming villages were still small by later standards, perhaps a few dozen families at most, but they represented a fundamental shift in how humans organised their lives and their relationships with the natural world. For the first time, people were not just taking from the environment but actively managing it. They were shaping landscapes to serve their needs, directing the evolution of other species, creating artificial ecosystems that existed nowhere else in nature. They had become, in a very real sense, partners with the plants and animals they depended on, locked into relationships of mutual dependence that would reshape all of their evolutionary futures. The psychological effects of this transformation were profound. People began to think of themselves differently, not as participants in natural systems, but as managers of them. The animals and plants they worked with were no longer fellow creatures, sharing the landscape, but resources to be optimised, problems to be solved, assets to be protected and improved. This shift in perspective was subtle but crucial. It marked the beginning of the conceptual separation between humans and nature that would come to define agricultural societies. Where hunter-gatherers saw themselves as embedded in the web of life, farmers began to see themselves as standing apart from it, directing it, controlling it for their own purposes. The changes weren't just conceptual, they were deeply practical. Managing crops and livestock required new forms of knowledge, new skills, new ways of organising time and labour. People needed to understand soil fertility, water management, plant and animal breeding, food storage and preservation. They needed to coordinate complex seasonal activities across entire communities. Leadership patterns began to shift as well. In mobile hunter-gatherer societies, authority was typically situational and temporary. The best tracker might lead during a hunt. The most experienced elder might guide decisions about camp location. But these roles rotated based on circumstances and expertise. In farming communities, certain kinds of knowledge and responsibility became more permanent and more crucial. Someone needed to decide when to plant and when to harvest. Someone needed to coordinate labour for major projects. like land clearance or irrigation. Someone needed to manage the complex logistics of food storage and distribution. Someone needed to negotiate with other communities for trade or mutual defence. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, some individuals began to accumulate more influence, more respect, more decision-making authority than others. Not through force or formal appointment, but through expertise, success, and the simple necessity of having someone coordinate increasingly complex community activities. These early leaders weren't rulers in any sense we would recognise. They had no armies, no palaces, no formal powers of coercion, but they represented the first stirrings of social hierarchy, the first movement away from the radically egalitarian societies that had characterised human life for hundreds of thousands of years. Inequality began to emerge in other ways as well. Some families were more successful at cultivation than others, whether through skill, luck, or simply having access to better land. These differences could compound over time, as successful farmers could afford to clear more land, acquire more animals, or invest in better tools and storage facilities. For the first time in human history, wealth could be accumulated and passed down across generations. A successful farmer could leave their children not just knowledge and relationships, but actual productive assets, cleared fields, stored grain, domesticated animals. These inherited advantages could be built upon, creating dynasties of prosperity that would have been impossible in mobile societies where possessions were limited to what could be carried. The seeds of class distinction were being planted alongside the grain, but these were still early days, and the differences between families remained relatively small. The vast inequalities that would characterise later civilizations had not yet emerged. Most early farming communities remained relatively egalitarian, with differences in wealth and status measured in small gradations rather than vast chasms. What was emerging, however, was a new form of human society, more complex, more hierarchical, more bound to place and routine than anything that had existed before. People were discovering that they could shape their environment in unprecedented ways, but they were also discovering that these new capabilities came with new constraints, new vulnerabilities, new forms of dependence. The transformation was accelerating. Each generation, born into this new way of life, found it more difficult to imagine alternatives. The knowledge needed for mobile hunting and gathering was being forgotten as communities invested all their time and energy in perfecting agricultural techniques. The wild landscapes that had once supported human life were being converted to fields and pastures, making return to the old ways increasingly impossible, even if anyone had wanted to attempt it. But few did want to go back. Despite the new challenges and constraints, the farming life offered real advantages that were difficult to deny. More predictable food supplies, more comfortable living conditions, larger and more stable communities, more sophisticated technologies, and cultural achievements. People were creating art and music and stories that reflected their new relationship with the land. They were developing religious beliefs and practices centered around the cycles of planting and harvest, the fertility of soil and animals, the mysteries of growth and renewal. They were building the first permanent structures designed not just for shelter, but for ceremony, community gathering, and the storage of collective memory. They were becoming, in other words, recognizably human in ways that would be familiar to us today. But they were also moving further and further away from the way of life that had shaped human evolution for millions of years. They were adapting to conditions that no human had ever faced before, solving problems that had never existed before, creating a form of society that had no precedent in the natural world. The great experiment was underway, and there would be no turning back. The trap had closed, but it was a trap baited with genuine benefits, real improvements to human life that made the cost seem worth paying, at least at first. The full price of the transformation would only become clear much later. when it was far too late to reconsider the bargain that had been struck, but that reckoning still lay in the future. For now, in these early millennia of agricultural development, the experiment seemed to be succeeding. Communities were growing, technologies were improving, and human life was becoming more secure and more comfortable than it had ever been before. The question of whether this represented progress or decline, improvement or mistake, would not be asked for thousands of years. The people living through the transformation experienced it as success, as mastery over the challenges that had always constrained human possibilities. They could not have known that they were also laying the foundations for problems that would plague human societies for all the millennia to come. Environmental degradation, social inequality, warfare over resources, the alienation that comes from seeing oneself as separate from the natural world. All of that was still hidden in the future, invisible in the small daily decisions that seem so reasonable, so beneficial, so obviously right. The seeds had been planted and they were beginning to sprout. The harvest, with all its abundance and all its consequences, was yet to come. What happens when the dead no longer leave? When ancestors stop being memories and start being neighbours? Around 8,000 years ago, something strange began appearing beneath the floors of houses in central Anatolia. Not storage pits or refuse deposits, but carefully arranged human skulls. Some still bearing traces of flesh, others polished smooth by handling. These weren't burials in any sense we might recognise. They were something else entirely, a practice that reveals how profoundly the settled life was changing not just how people lived, but how they thought about death, memory and belonging. At a site called Çatalhöyük, archaeologists have uncovered one of the most remarkable early farming communities ever found. Houses pressed so tightly together that there were no streets between them, only rooftops that served as pathways from dwelling to dwelling. People entered their homes through holes in the ceiling, climbing down ladders into spaces that were part house, part workshop, part shrine. And beneath many of these floors lay the remains of the dead. Not just buried and forgotten, but curated, maintained, revisited. The skulls were the most carefully treated, removed from bodies after death, cleaned of flesh, sometimes painted with ochre or adorned with shell and stone. They were kept in the living spaces, handled, displayed, perhaps consulted. Some show wear patterns that suggest they were regularly moved or touched. These weren't relics gathering dust in forgotten corners. They were active participants in daily life. This practice of skull curation was not unique to Çatalhöyük. Similar patterns appear across the early farming world, from the Jordan Valley to the Anatolian highlands. Wherever people were making the transition from mobile to settled life, the dead were refusing to stay buried. They were being brought into the realm of the living in ways that would have been impossible for mobile hunter-gatherers who necessarily left their dead behind when they moved to new territories. The implications are profound. When you bury your ancestors beneath your floor, you're making a statement about permanence, about belonging, about the indissoluble connection between people and place. You are saying that this ground is sacred not because of any inherent spiritual quality, but because it holds the bones of your lineage. You are creating a form of ownership that goes deeper than mere occupation. You are claiming the land through death itself. But this connection between ancestors and territory came with psychological costs that are difficult for us to fully grasp. Imagine living your entire life above the remains of your grandparents, great-grandparents, and their ancestors before them. Imagine the weight of that presence, the constant reminder that you are not just an individual making choices, but a link in an unbroken chain stretching back through generations and forward into an uncertain future. The dead became a form of social pressure, silent witnesses to every decision, every deviation from tradition, every moment of doubt about the wisdom of the settled life. They were reminders that this place, these fields, These houses were not just practical arrangements, but sacred trusts passed down from those who had come before. To abandon them would be to abandon the ancestors themselves. This ancestor-centered worldview began to reshape social relationships in fundamental ways. Kinship became more important than it had ever been for mobile peoples, because kinship determined not just your relationships with the living, but your connection to the ancestral dead who legitimized your claim to the land. Family lines became pathways to inheritance, not just of material goods, but of spiritual authority and territorial rights. Disputes that might once have been resolved by separation or negotiation now carried the weight of ancestral judgment. If your great-grandfather's skull lay beneath your hearth, you could not easily abandon your claim to the surrounding fields, even if staying meant conflict with neighbours or struggling against poor harvests. The dead had made mobility impossible, not through physical constraint, but through emotional and spiritual obligation. The practice also began to create new forms of inequality. Not all ancestors were treated equally. Some skulls received more elaborate treatment, more prominent placement, more careful maintenance. Some families seemed to have more prestigious dead than others, more ancient lineages, deeper roots in the sacred soil. These differences in ancestral status began to translate into differences in social authority among the living. For the first time in human history, people could claim superiority not based on their own achievements or abilities, but on the accomplishments of their dead relatives. A family whose ancestors had been the first to clear a particular field, or who had died defending the community from raiders, or who had possessed special knowledge about the spirits of the place, could use that heritage to justify preferential treatment in disputes over land, resources, or decision-making authority. The transformation was gradual, almost invisible. Each generation that grew up surrounded by ancestral remains came to see this arrangement as natural, inevitable, the only way human societies could be organised. They could not imagine a world where the dead were left behind, where people moved freely across landscapes without spiritual obligations to particular places, where authority was based on immediate circumstances rather than inherited status. But the psychological burden was immense. People were no longer just responsible for their own survival and success. They were custodians of an entire ancestral legacy. Every decision had to be weighed not just against immediate practical considerations, but against the imagined judgment of the dead. Innovation became suspect. Change became dangerous, because altering the way things had always been done risked offending the spirits who watched from beneath the floors. This conservatism was reinforced by the practical constraints of the farming life. Unlike mobile hunter-gatherers, who could experiment with new techniques and abandon them if they failed without serious consequences, settled farmers were locked into annual cycles that left little room for error. A failed experiment with new crops or cultivation methods could mean starvation for the entire community. The dead seemed to whisper constant warnings against taking unnecessary risks. The presence of ancestors also began to change concepts of time and identity. Mobile peoples lived in an eternal present, responding to immediate conditions, adapting to changing circumstances with the fluid flexibility that had enabled human survival for hundreds of thousands of years. But farming communities became oriented toward continuity, toward maintaining the patterns established by previous generations, toward ensuring that the ancestral way of life would persist into the indefinite future. Individual identity became subordinated to collective identity in ways that would have been foreign to earlier human societies. You were not just yourself. You were a representative of your lineage, a temporary caretaker of ancestral property, a bridge between the dead who had come before and the unborn who would come after. Your personal desires and ambitions mattered less than your obligations to this vast web of kinship that stretched across time. The house itself became a kind of temple, a sacred space where the living and dead coexisted in intimate proximity. The daily activities of cooking, sleeping, working, and socializing took place in the presence of ancestral spirits who were imagined to be watching, judging, protecting, or threatening, depending on how well their descendants honoured their memory and maintained their traditions. Religious beliefs began to crystallise around these practices in ways that would echo through all subsequent human history. The gods became ancestors, writ large, powerful dead who demanded proper treatment, regular offerings, strict adherence to established customs. Priesthoods emerged to manage these relationships, to interpret the will of the ancestral spirits, to perform the rituals that kept the dead satisfied and the living protected. But perhaps the most profound change was in how people understood their relationship to the natural world. Mobile hunter-gatherers had seen themselves as participants in natural cycles, embedded in the web of life that connected all living things. Farmers surrounded by their domestic plants and animals and guided by their ancestral dead began to see themselves as separate from and superior to the wild world beyond their settlements. The ancestors had conquered this land, cleared these fields, tamed these animals. The living inherited not just the physical results of that conquest, but the spiritual authority to continue it. Nature became something to be managed, controlled, improved upon, rather than something to be lived within. The wild became foreign, dangerous, a realm of chaos that threatened the ordered world the ancestors had created. This shift in consciousness was subtle but revolutionary. It marks the beginning of the conceptual framework that would eventually justify humanity's domination over the entire planet. But it began simply, quietly, with the decision to keep the dead close rather than letting them return to the earth that had given them life. The skulls beneath the floors were more than memorials. They were anchors, chains, promises, and threats all at once. They bound people to place with bonds stronger than any physical constraint, because they made abandonment not just impractical, but spiritually catastrophic. They transformed temporary settlements into eternal homes, practical arrangements into sacred obligations, individual choices into collective destinies. By the time anyone might have questioned whether this arrangement was beneficial, it was already too late to imagine alternatives. The dead had become too numerous, too powerful, too essential to the social order. They had made the settled life not just preferable, but inescapable, not just through the practical constraints of farming, but through the spiritual constraints of ancestral obligation. The people of Çatalhöyük and similar communities could not have foreseen where this path would lead, to cities built on the bones of the forgotten dead, to nations that claimed divine mandate through ancestral right, to civilizations that would sacrifice the living to honour the memory of those who'd passed into legend. They were simply trying to make sense of their new relationship to place and time, to create meaning and continuity in a way of life that had no precedent in human experience. But in doing so, they had planted seeds that would grow into some of humanity's most enduring institutions: property rights based on inheritance, social hierarchies justified by bloodline, religious systems centered on the worship of ancestral spirits, and the fundamental belief that some places are more sacred than others because of who has died there. The transformation was complete, even if its full implications would not become apparent for millennia to come. Humans had become bound to the earth, not just by their need for food and shelter, but by their obligations to the dead. They had traded the freedom of the horizon for the security of the hearth, the flexibility of the nomad for the rootedness of the farmer. And beneath their floors, the ancestors waited in silence, their hollow sockets watching over a world they had helped to create, but could no longer fully understand. A world where the living were becoming as fixed and permanent as the dead themselves, where change was becoming as difficult as resurrection, where the future was becoming as immutable as the past. The skulls would crumble eventually, as all things do, but the ideas they represented, about place and belonging, about inheritance and obligation, about the sacred nature of settled life, would prove far more durable than bone. They would outlive the houses that sheltered them, the communities that created them, even the civilizations that grew from their foundations. And in their endurance, they would shape every human society that came after, creating patterns of thought and behaviour that we still struggle to understand, let alone escape. The dead had won their final victory, not over death, but over the living, binding them to earth and custom, with chains forged from love, memory, and the desperate human need to believe that nothing important ever truly ends. The trap was closing, but it was a trap that felt like liberation. By 7,000 years ago, across the river valleys and fertile plains of what we now call the Middle East and Anatolia, something unprecedented was happening. Villages were growing larger, more complex, more permanent than anything human beings had ever built before. And for the first time in our species' long history, people were beginning to discover what it meant to have more than enough. Surplus, the word sounds simple, almost innocent, but surplus was the key that would unlock every door that followed. The door to inequality, to specialization, to power, to war, to everything we now call civilization. Because when you have more grain than your family can eat, more animals than you can tend alone, more goods than you can use, you face a problem that no human society had ever confronted before. What do you do with abundance? The first farmers solved this problem in ways that seemed perfectly reasonable at the time. They stored the extra grain in larger pits, in sealed containers, in communal granaries that could feed entire communities through lean seasons. They traded surplus crops for materials they couldn't produce locally: obsidian for cutting tools, shells for decoration, copper for the first primitive ornaments and implements. They used extra food to support people who could specialize in activities other than farming: toolmakers, potters, weavers, traders. But surplus had an unexpected side effect. It created time. For the first time in human history, not everyone needed to spend every waking hour focused on immediate survival. Some people could think about tomorrow, next season, next year. They could experiment, innovate, create. They could sit in the evening firelight and wonder about the stars, the spirits, the meaning of existence itself. This liberation of human consciousness was genuinely revolutionary. Art became more sophisticated, more symbolic, more deeply embedded with meaning. Religious beliefs grew more complex, more systematic, more institutionalized. Technologies advanced beyond the simple tools needed for daily survival toward true innovations. The wheel, the plough, the sail, the first tentative experiments with metalworking. But time, like surplus, was not distributed equally, and in that inequality lay the seeds of a transformation that would prove even more consequential than the shift from hunting to farming. Because while everyone in these early agricultural communities benefited from the greater food security and material comfort that farming provided, not everyone benefited equally from the surplus that farming generated. Some families were simply better at agriculture than others. They had better land, better luck with weather, better skills at managing crops and animals. Their harvests were larger, their stores fuller, their ability to weather bad seasons more secure. These advantages, small at first, began to compound over generations. A family with surplus grain could afford to clear more land, acquire more animals, trade for better tools. They could support more children who could help with the increasingly complex work of intensive farming. They could build larger houses, accumulate more possessions, establish trading relationships with distant communities. Most importantly, they could afford to have some family members specialise in activities other than farming. A son could become a skilled toolmaker, spending his days crafting implements that could be traded for additional resources. A daughter could master the complex arts of pottery or weaving, creating goods that were valued far beyond their practical utility. These specialists, freed from the daily demands of agricultural labour, began to develop expertise that made them valuable not just to their own families, but to entire communities. A skilled metal worker could provide tools for dozens of farmers. A talented potter could supply storage vessels for whole villages. A knowledgeable trader could establish networks that brought exotic materials from hundreds of kilometers away. But specialization created dependencies that had never existed in mobile hunter-gatherer societies. The toolmaker needed farmers to provide food. The farmers needed toolmakers to provide implements. The trader needed both to provide goods for exchange. These relationships were not just economic, they were social, cultural, almost spiritual in their intensity. For the first time in human history, people's survival depended not just on their own skills and their relationships with their immediate kin group, but on complex webs of exchange and obligation that connected them to strangers, to distant communities, to economic systems they could not fully understand or control. The psychological effects of this transformation were profound. People began to think of themselves not just as individuals or family members, but as participants in larger social systems. They developed new concepts of identity based on their specialized roles: farmer, potter, trader, priest. They began to measure their worth not just by their personal qualities, but by their contributions to community welfare and their position in networks of exchange. Social hierarchies that had been fluid and temporary in mobile societies began to crystallize into more permanent structures. The most successful farmers, the most skilled specialists, the most effective traders began to accumulate not just material wealth, but social influence, respect, authority over community decisions. Leadership patterns changed accordingly. Instead of the situational, rotating authority that characterized hunter-gatherer bands, farming communities began to develop more stable leadership roles. Someone needed to coordinate planting and harvesting schedules. Someone needed to manage communal storage facilities. Someone needed to organize defense against raiders or negotiate with neighboring communities. These leadership positions, initially based on practical necessity and recognized expertise, gradually began to carry privileges that extended beyond their immediate functions. Leaders ate better, lived in larger houses, wore finer clothing, possessed more valuable objects. Their families enjoyed higher status, better marriage prospects, greater security. But perhaps the most significant change was in how people thought about the future. Mobile hunter-gatherers had lived in an eternal present, adapting to immediate circumstances with the fluid flexibility that had enabled human survival for hundreds of thousands of years. Farmers, with their seasonal cycles and multi-year investment strategies, had already begun to think in longer time horizons. But people with surplus began to think even further ahead, not just to next season or next year, but to the next generation and beyond. Wealth could be accumulated and passed down. Knowledge could be preserved and transmitted. Social position could be inherited along with material possessions. For the first time in human history, what you were born into began to matter more than what you achieved through your own efforts. The egalitarian ethos that had characterized human societies since the emergence of our species began to crack under the pressure of accumulated advantage. Children born into successful families had access to better food, better education, better tools, better connections. They were more likely to survive childhood, more likely to thrive as adults, more likely to pass these advantages on to their own children. The cycle was self-reinforcing. Success bred success, advantage bred advantage, and over time, small initial differences in luck or skill began to harden into systematic inequalities that would persist for generations. But these changes were still subtle, still emerging. The vast chasms between rich and poor that would characterize later civilizations had not yet opened. Most early farming communities remained relatively egalitarian by modern standards, with differences in wealth and status measured in gradations rather than orders of magnitude. What was emerging, however, was the conceptual framework that would eventually justify much greater inequalities. If some people were naturally better at farming, if some families consistently made wiser decisions, if some individuals possessed special knowledge or skills that benefited the entire community, then perhaps it was natural, even beneficial, for these people to have more resources, more influence, more authority over others. The ideology of merit was being born, the belief that social hierarchies reflected natural differences in ability, character, or divine favour rather than accidents of birth or circumstance. This ideology would prove remarkably durable, surviving the collapse of countless civilizations and adapting itself to every form of social organisation that humans would subsequently develop. But for now, in these early millennia of agricultural development, inequality was still experienced more as opportunity than oppression. The communities were small enough that everyone knew everyone else personally. The differences in wealth were modest enough that they didn't fundamentally alter daily social relationships. The advantages of specialisation and surplus were visible to everyone, and most people felt they were benefiting from the new arrangements, even if they weren't benefiting equally. The trap was still comfortable, still generous with its rewards. The full costs, environmental degradation, social conflict, the alienation that comes from extreme inequality remained hidden in the future, invisible consequences of choices that seemed entirely reasonable in their immediate context. People were creating the foundations of everything we now call civilization. They were developing the technologies, the social institutions, the cultural practices, the ways of thinking that would enable humans to build cities, empires, and eventually the complex global systems that define our modern world. But they were also, unknowingly, creating the foundations for most of the problems that continue to plague human societies today. The concentration of wealth and power in the hands of elites, the exploitation of the many by the few, the destruction of natural environments in pursuit of economic growth, the psychological suffering that comes from measuring human worth in terms of material accumulation. The greatest irony is that these early farmers were trying to create security, stability, and abundance for themselves and their children. They succeeded beyond their wildest dreams, but in ways they could never have anticipated. They created abundance, but also scarcity. They created security for some, but insecurity for others. They created opportunities for human flourishing, but also new forms of human suffering. The seeds they planted grew into forests so vast and complex that their descendants would lose sight of the original intentions. The simple desire for enough food to feed their families and enough comfort to sleep peacefully at night. The harvest would be abundant beyond imagination, but it would also be bitter with consequences that no one had foreseen. And in that bittersweet harvest, we can perhaps find the answer to our original question. Farming was neither humanity's greatest achievement nor its greatest mistake. It was simply humanity's most consequential choice, a decision that solved immediate problems while creating new ones, that opened doors to incredible possibilities while closing off others, that made us more than we had ever been, while also making us less than we might have remained. The transformation was irreversible, but it was not inevitable. At every step along the way, people made choices based on the information they had and the circumstances they faced. Different choices might have led to different outcomes, different forms of human society, different relationships between people and the natural world. But the choices they made were understandable, even admirable in their immediate context. They were trying to build better lives for themselves and their children, to create security in an uncertain world, to harness human intelligence and cooperation in service of human flourishing. That they succeeded so completely, and that their success came with such unforeseen costs, is perhaps the deepest tragedy and the greatest triumph of the human story. We are still living with the consequences of their choices, still trying to understand what they set in motion, still struggling to find ways to preserve the benefits of their innovations while mitigating the harm they inadvertently created. The story continues, as it must, but in understanding how it began, we might find clues about how it might unfold differently in the chapters yet to be written. What happens when abundance becomes a cage? When the very success of farming begins to reshape not just how people live, but what they believe about themselves, their neighbours, and their place in the world. By 6,000 years ago, across the river valleys and highland plateaus, where agriculture had first taken root, something new was stirring beneath the surface of these settled communities. Not just surplus grain or specialised crafts, but ideas. Ideas about ownership, about hierarchy, about who deserved what and why. The transformation was subtle at first. In the early farming villages, differences in wealth had been modest, temporary, based more on luck than design. A good harvest here, a successful trade there, but nothing that fundamentally altered the fabric of community life. Most people still knew each other personally, still shared in communal activities, still operated under the assumption that everyone deserved enough to survive comfortably. But as generations passed and surpluses accumulated, these small differences began to crystallise into something more permanent. Families that had been successful for several seasons running started to think of their success as natural, deserved, perhaps even divinely ordained. They developed explanations for their good fortune that went beyond simple chance. They were harder working, more intelligent, more favoured by the spirits of the land. These explanations, innocent enough in themselves, began to shape behaviour in profound ways. Successful families started to make decisions that would protect and expand their advantages. They arranged marriages with other successful families, combining resources and expertise. They invested in better tools, more elaborate storage facilities, larger houses that announced their prosperity to the entire community. Most significantly, they began to think differently about sharing. The radical egalitarianism that had characterized human societies for hundreds of thousands of years, the expectation that anyone with surplus would distribute it freely to those in need, began to weaken under the pressure of accumulated wealth. Why should a family that had worked hard and made wise decisions give away their extra grain to families that had been less successful? This shift in attitude was gradual, almost imperceptible. It wasn't that successful families became cruel or indifferent to their neighbours' suffering. They still helped during genuine emergencies, still participated in communal festivals and ceremonies, still considered themselves part of the same community. But the automatic, unquestioned sharing that had once defined human social relationships began to require justification, negotiation, reciprocal obligations. The language people used to describe these relationships began to change as well. What had once been gifts freely given became loans that carried expectations of return. What had once been mutual aid became charity that created debts of gratitude. What had once been community property began to be described in terms of individual or family ownership. These linguistic shifts reflected deeper changes in how people understood their relationships with each other and with the land itself. The concept of private property, which would seem so natural to later generations, was being invented slowly, quietly, through thousands of small decisions about who could use what resources under which circumstances. Land was the most contentious issue. In mobile hunter-gatherer societies, territory had been fluid, overlapping, subject to negotiation based on seasonal needs and population movements. But farmers had invested labour in specific plots, clearing stones, building terraces, improving soil fertility through years of careful management. These investments created emotional and practical attachments that were difficult to ignore or override. Gradually, informally, certain families began to be associated with certain fields. Not through formal ownership, as we would understand it, but through recognised patterns of use, improvement and care. Other community members began to defer to these families' decisions about when to plant, what to grow, how to manage the land that everyone understood they had worked to improve. This process was accelerated by the increasing complexity of agricultural techniques. Farming was no longer simply a matter of scattering seeds and hoping for the best. It required sophisticated knowledge about soil types, drainage patterns, crop rotations, pest management, storage methods. This expertise took years to develop and was often closely guarded within families, passed down from parents to children, along with the physical assets they had accumulated. Knowledge became a form of property in its own right, as valuable as land or livestock or stored grain. Families that possessed superior agricultural techniques could consistently produce larger harvests, which allowed them to accumulate more resources, which gave them the leisure time to develop even more sophisticated methods. The cycle was self-reinforcing, creating widening gaps between those who knew and those who didn't. But perhaps the most profound change was in how people thought about the future. Mobile hunter-gatherers had lived in an eternal present, adapting fluidly to changing circumstances with the confidence that their knowledge and relationships would see them through whatever challenges arose. Early farmers had begun to think in terms of seasons and years, planning ahead for predictable cycles of planting and harvest. Now, as wealth began to accumulate across generations, people started to think in terms of decades and centuries. They made decisions not just for themselves, but for their children and grandchildren. They began to see their lives as part of longer narratives that extended far beyond their individual existence. This expanded time horizon created new forms of anxiety and ambition. Parents worried not just about feeding their children, but about giving them advantages that would last throughout their lives. They began to think strategically about marriage alliances, about which skills to teach their offspring, about how to position their families for success in an increasingly complex social environment. Children, in turn, began to be raised with expectations that would have been foreign to earlier generations. Instead of learning to be flexible, adaptable, ready to respond to whatever circumstances arose, they were taught to maintain and expand the advantages their parents had worked to create. They were educated not just in practical skills, but in the attitudes and behaviours that would mark them as members of successful families. Social relationships became more complex, more calculated, more influenced by considerations of status and advantage. Friendships were still important, but they were increasingly shaped by compatibility of social position. Marriages became strategic alliances that could combine resources, expertise, and influence in ways that benefited entire extended families. Even religious beliefs began to reflect these new social realities. The spirits and deities that had once been understood as forces of nature, unpredictable and egalitarian in their treatment of human beings, began to be seen as entities that could be influenced through proper behaviour, correct rituals, appropriate offerings. Some families claimed special relationships with particular spirits, special knowledge about how to gain their favour, special authority to interpret their will. These claims of spiritual privilege provided justification for material advantages that might otherwise have seemed arbitrary or unfair. If the gods favoured certain families with larger harvests, healthier livestock, more successful children, then perhaps those families deserved their good fortune. Perhaps their prosperity was evidence of divine approval rather than simple luck or superior technique. The development of religious hierarchies paralleled and reinforced the emergence of economic hierarchies. Families that could afford to make larger offerings to the spirits, that had the leisure time to master complex rituals, that could trace their lineages back to the community's founders or to legendary ancestors, began to claim roles as intermediaries between the human and divine realms. These early priests, for that is what they were becoming, though the role had no formal name or institutional structure, provided services that the entire community valued. Intercession with the spirits, interpretation of omens, guidance about when to plant and harvest, mediation of disputes that might otherwise tear the community apart. But their services came at a cost, and that cost was paid primarily by families that lacked the resources to provide their own spiritual expertise. The poor became dependent on the rich, not just for material assistance, but for access to the divine realm, for protection against spiritual dangers, for participation in the ritual life that gave meaning and structure to community existence. This spiritual dependency created new forms of inequality that went beyond simple differences in material wealth. Some families began to be seen as inherently more sacred than others, more connected to the forces that governed human fate, more deserving of respect and deference from their neighbours. The egalitarian ethos that had once insisted that all human beings were fundamentally equal in worth and dignity began to crack under the pressure of these accumulated differences. If some families were more successful, more knowledgeable, more spiritually powerful than others, then perhaps human beings were not actually equal after all. Perhaps hierarchy was natural, inevitable, even beneficial for the community as a whole. These ideas, once they took root, proved remarkably durable and adaptable. They would survive the collapse of individual communities, the rise and fall of entire civilizations, the transformation of human societies from small farming villages to vast urban empires. They would be refined, systematized, and institutionalized in countless different ways, but their essential logic would remain constant. Some people are naturally superior to others, and social arrangements should reflect these natural differences. But in these early stages, inequality was still relatively modest and still justified primarily in terms of practical benefits to the community. The successful families were expected to use their advantages responsibly, to help their neighbours during emergencies, to contribute generously to communal projects and celebrations. Their privileges came with obligations that limited how far above their neighbours they could rise. The system was still recognisably human in scale, still embedded in personal relationships and mutual obligations that prevented the complete exploitation of the weak by the strong. The vast impersonal inequalities that would characterise later civilizations had not yet emerged. Most people still felt that they belonged to communities where their voices mattered, where their contributions were valued, where their basic needs would be met, regardless of their individual success or failure. But the foundations were being laid for something much more hierarchical, much more exploitative, much more divorced from the egalitarian values that had guided human societies since the emergence of our species. The trap was still comfortable for most people, still generous with its rewards, still justified by genuine benefits that everyone could see and appreciate. The full costs, the concentration of power in the hands of tiny elites, the systematic exploitation of the many by the few, the development of ideologies that would justify almost any level of inequality remained hidden in the future, unimaginable consequences of choices that seemed entirely reasonable in their immediate context. People were trying to create stability, security, and prosperity for themselves and their children. They were succeeding, but in ways that would eventually undermine the very values they were trying to protect. They were building communities based on cooperation and mutual aid, but they were also creating the conditions that would eventually make such communities impossible to sustain. The irony was profound, but it was also invisible to the people living through it. They could see the immediate benefits of their innovations: more food, better tools, larger communities, more sophisticated cultural achievements. They could not see the long-term costs because those costs would be paid by people not yet born, in circumstances not yet imaginable, through processes not yet set in motion. The greatest tragedy of the agricultural revolution may not have been that it failed, but that it succeeded so completely. It gave human beings everything they thought they wanted: security, abundance, the power to shape their environment according to their desires. But it also gave them things they had never wanted: and could never have anticipated inequality, exploitation, alienation from the natural world that had given them birth. The harvest was coming in, rich beyond all previous human experience, but mixed in with the grain were seeds of a completely different kind, seeds that would grow into thorns, that would pierce the heart of every human society that came after. The transformation was almost complete, but its true consequences were only beginning to unfold. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the first farming communities stirred to life, no one could have imagined where these small changes would lead. They were simply trying to live well, to provide for their families, to build something lasting in a world that had always been characterized by change and uncertainty. They succeeded beyond their wildest dreams, but also beyond their worst nightmares. The world they created would be both more wonderful and more terrible than anything their hunter-gatherer ancestors could have conceived, and we, their descendants, are still trying to understand what they set in motion, still struggling to find ways to preserve their gifts while healing the wounds their choices inadvertently created. The story continues as it must, but in understanding how it began, we might find wisdom about how it should unfold. The seeds have grown into forests so vast we can barely see their edges, but perhaps, if we look carefully enough, we can still find our way back to the clearing where it all began, where human hands first closed around wild grain and wondered what might grow from such a simple act of faith. The question that haunts the empty ruins of those first villages is not whether we made the right choice, but whether we had any choice at all. Because by 5,000 years ago, something irreversible had crystallized in the settled communities scattered across the ancient world. Not just the accumulation of wealth or the emergence of hierarchy, but something deeper, more fundamental to human consciousness itself, the birth of a new kind of time. For hundreds of thousands of years, our ancestors had lived in cycles. Seasons turned, herds migrated, plants ripened and died and grew again. Time was circular, eternal, always returning to where it began. The stories they told reflected this rhythm. Tales of death and rebirth, of endings that were also beginnings, of a world that renewed itself endlessly, without need for human intervention or improvements. But farming changed time from a circle into an arrow. Suddenly there was progress to be made, improvement to be achieved, a future that could be better than the past if only people worked hard enough and made the right decisions. The field cleared this year would be more productive next year. The techniques learned by this generation would benefit the next. The wealth accumulated by parents would give their children advantages their grandparents could never have imagined. This linear conception of time was intoxicating in its possibilities. It suggested that human beings were not merely passengers on an endless cosmic wheel, but agents of their own destiny, capable of shaping the world according to their desires and dreams. It promised that suffering was not inevitable, that scarcity could be overcome, that the human condition itself could be fundamentally improved through intelligence, effort, and careful planning. But linear time also carried within it the seeds of anxiety, competition, and restless dissatisfaction that would come to define the human experience. If tomorrow could be better than today, then today was not good enough. If progress was possible, then stagnation was failure. If some families were advancing while others remained behind, then everyone needed to compete or risk being left in the dust of others' success. The psychological transformation was as profound as any material change. People began to measure their lives not against the eternal rhythms of nature, but against the achievements of their neighbours, the expectations of their parents, the imagined judgment of future generations. Happiness became contingent, not on accepting what was, but on achieving what might be. Children growing up in these communities learned to think about themselves differently than any humans ever had before. They were not just individuals trying to survive and thrive in whatever circumstances they encountered, but links in chains of progress that stretched backward to ancestral accomplishments and forward to possibilities not yet realised. Their worth was measured not just by their immediate contributions to family and community welfare, but by their potential to advance the long-term projects their societies had undertaken. Education became purposeful in entirely new ways. Instead of learning to be flexible and adaptive, children were taught to be productive and ambitious. Instead of mastering the broad range of skills needed for survival in changing circumstances, they specialised in the particular abilities that would help them succeed in an increasingly complex and competitive social environment. Play itself was transformed from spontaneous exploration of the world into preparation for adult roles. Children mimicked not just the activities they saw around them, but the attitudes and aspirations that drove their parents' choices. They learned to defer gratification, to plan for the future, to think strategically about relationships and opportunities. The stories communities told began to change as well. The old tales of eternal cycles gave way to narratives of heroes who accomplished great deeds, of peoples who overcame obstacles through courage and cleverness, of gods who rewarded hard work and punished laziness. These stories weren't just entertainment, they were instruction manuals for living in a world where progress was possible and stagnation was dangerous. Religious beliefs evolved to match this new understanding of time and human possibility. The spirits that had once been seen as unpredictable forces of nature became entities that could be bargained with, influenced, even commanded by those who knew the proper techniques. Rituals became less about accepting the will of the gods and more about persuading them to grant human wishes for prosperity, fertility, victory over enemies. Some families claimed special expertise in these negotiations with the divine realm. They developed elaborate ceremonies, built impressive shrines, accumulated sacred objects that supposedly enhanced their ability to influence spiritual forces. These religious specialists, shamans, priests, oracles, began to occupy positions of authority that extended far beyond their ritual functions. Their power rested on a simple but revolutionary claim that the gods had preferences about how human societies should be organised, and that these preferences happened to coincide with arrangements that benefited the religious elite. The spirits favoured hard work, respect for authority, generous offerings to their earthly representatives. They punished communities that failed to maintain proper hierarchies, that allowed the undeserving to prosper, that questioned the wisdom of established traditions. This divine sanction for inequality transformed what had once been temporary differences in wealth and status into permanent features of the social landscape. If the gods themselves supported the existing order, then challenging it was not just impractical, but morally wrong, spiritually dangerous for individuals and communities alike. The poor began to internalise explanations for their poverty that had nothing to do with luck, circumstance, or systemic disadvantage. They were told, and eventually came to believe, that their struggles reflected personal failings, laziness, moral weakness, insufficient devotion to the spirits that governed human fate. Their suffering was not a social problem to be solved collectively, but a spiritual problem that could only be addressed through individual reformation. This ideology was remarkably effective at maintaining social stability even as inequalities widened and hardened. People who might otherwise have rebelled against unfair treatment instead focused their energy on trying to improve their spiritual standing, hoping that proper behaviour would eventually be rewarded with material advancement. The wealthy, meanwhile, developed elaborate justifications for their privileges that went far beyond simple claims of superior effort or ability. They were blessed by the gods, chosen for leadership, entrusted with resources that they held not for their own benefit but as stewards for the entire community. Their luxury was actually sacrifice, their power actually service, their advantages actually burdens that they bore for the greater good. These rationalizations weren't entirely cynical. Many successful families genuinely believed in their own righteousness, genuinely felt that their prosperity was evidence of divine favour and moral superiority. They developed codes of behaviour that emphasised their responsibilities along with their privileges, their obligations to help the less fortunate, even as those obligations were defined in ways that preserved fundamental inequalities. But belief in one's own virtue, however sincere, can be more dangerous than simple greed or ambition. People who are convinced that their advantages are morally justified will defend them with a ferocity that purely selfish individuals rarely achieve. They will sacrifice others' welfare to preserve their own position, not despite their moral convictions, but because of them. The communities that emerged from this ideological transformation were more stable and more productive than their egalitarian predecessors, but they were also more rigid, more hierarchical, more capable of systematic oppression. They could mobilize resources for impressive collective projects, monumental architecture, complex irrigation systems, far-ranging trade networks, but they could also sustain levels of inequality that would have been impossible in smaller, more personal societies. The scale of human organization was expanding beyond anything evolution had prepared our species to handle. Communities grew from dozens to hundreds to thousands of individuals, most of whom would never know each other personally. The intimate, face-to-face relationships that had once regulated all human interactions were supplemented and sometimes replaced by abstract rules, formal institutions, impersonal systems of authority and control. People began to relate to each other not as unique individuals with personal histories and complex motivations, but as representatives of social categories, rich or poor, powerful or weak, sacred or profane. These categories shaped expectations, determined opportunities, and justified treatment that would have been unthinkable between people who knew each other as complete human beings. The anonymity that came with larger populations created new possibilities for both cooperation and exploitation. Strangers could engage in complex transactions based on shared understanding of roles and rules rather than personal trust and mutual obligation. But they could also treat each other with indifference or cruelty that would have been impossible in smaller communities where everyone's reputation mattered and everyone's welfare was interconnected. Trade networks expanded to connect communities separated by hundreds of kilometres, bringing exotic materials and new ideas across vast distances. But these same networks also spread diseases, conflicts, and social innovations that could destabilise traditional ways of life in places far from their origins. Warfare became more organised, more devastating, more capable of destruction that extended beyond immediate participants to entire populations. The raids and skirmishes that had once settled disputes between small groups evolved into campaigns of conquest that could subjugate entire regions, incorporating their populations into expanding political systems that concentrated power in the hands of increasingly distant elites. The transformation was accelerating, but it was also becoming harder to see clearly. People living through these changes experienced them as gradual adjustments to familiar patterns rather than revolutionary breaks with the past. Each generation adapted to slightly different circumstances. Each community modified its traditions in response to new pressures and opportunities. But the cumulative effect was staggering. By 4,000 years ago, human societies existed that would have been completely incomprehensible to hunter-gatherers from just a few millennia earlier. Cities housed tens of thousands of people in permanent structures that rose multiple stories above ground level. Kings claimed divine authority over territories spanning hundreds of kilometres. Armies marched in formation, carrying standardised weapons produced by specialised craftsmen. Writing systems preserved laws, stories, and administrative records that could outlast the individuals who created them. Mathematical knowledge enabled the construction of monuments whose precision and scale still inspire wonder today. Astronomical observations tracked celestial cycles with accuracy that would not be surpassed for thousands of years. Human beings had become capable of achievements that seemed to transcend the limitations of biology, geography, and individual mortality. They were building civilizations that could persist across centuries, accumulating knowledge and power at rates that dwarfed anything possible in smaller, simpler societies. But they were also creating problems that would prove far more persistent than their solutions. Environmental degradation that would outlast the societies that caused it. Social institutions that would oppress countless generations. Patterns of thought and behaviour that would shape human experience long after the specific circumstances that created them had been forgotten. The trap had not just closed, it had become invisible. People could no longer imagine alternatives to the systems they had created because those systems had shaped their consciousness so completely that other possibilities literally could not be conceived. The freedom their ancestors had known was not just practically inaccessible, but psychologically unthinkable. And yet in quiet moments when the noise of civilization died down, something ancestral still stirred in human hearts. A longing for simpler rhythms, for closer connections to the natural world, for communities small enough that everyone mattered and no one was anonymous. A sense that something essential had been lost in the pursuit of progress, something that all the achievements of settled life could not replace. This longing would surface again and again throughout human history, in religious movements that promised return to a golden age of simplicity, in philosophical traditions that questioned the value of material advancement, in artistic expressions that celebrated the wild and untamed aspects of existence that civilization had tried to eliminate. But it would remain largely powerless against the momentum of the systems that had been set in motion. The harvest was too abundant, the achievements too impressive, the possibilities too intoxicating for people to seriously consider abandoning the path their ancestors had chosen. The great experiment continued, as it had to. There was no going back, no undoing what had been done, no escape from the consequences of choices made in good faith by people who could not have foreseen where they would lead. But in understanding how it all began, in tracing the slow transformation from freedom to constraint, from equality to hierarchy, from harmony with nature to dominion over it, we might find clues about how to live more wisely within the systems we have inherited. We might learn to see the cage we have built around ourselves, even if we cannot break free from it. The story continues as it must, but perhaps if we listen carefully to the echoes of that distant past, we can write its next chapters with greater awareness of what we stand to gain and lose in every choice we make about how to organise human life on this planet that still remembers in its deepest places what we were like before we decided we could improve on what evolution had given us. The question remains open, will always remain open. Was farming our greatest achievement or our greatest mistake? Perhaps the answer is that it was both, simultaneously and inseparably, a choice that made us more than we had ever been, while also making us less than we might have remained. A transformation so complete and irreversible that we can only wonder what other possibilities lie buried beneath the foundations of the world we have built. The bones remember what the stories have forgotten. In the dust of Syria, beneath layers of ash and abandonment, archaeologists have uncovered something that challenges every comfortable narrative about early farming life. At a site called Tel Essawan, dating to around 7,000 years ago, the skeletons tell a story their living owners never intended to preserve. Bodies buried hastily in shallow graves, skulls bearing the unmistakable marks of violence, evidence of a community that ended not in peaceful transition or gradual decline, but in something much more sudden and much more final. This was not an isolated incident. Across the early farming world, from the valleys of Mesopotamia to the highlands of Anatolia, the archaeological record preserves glimpses of a darker side to the settled life, sites abandoned without explanation, storage facilities burned and never rebuilt, mass graves containing the remains of entire families, sometimes entire communities, killed by weapons designed not for hunting animals, but for harming other human beings. The violence was not random. These were not the casualties of natural disasters or epidemic diseases. The patterns of trauma, the positioning of bodies, the distribution of age and gender among the victims all point towards something more systematic, more deliberate. These were attacks, raids, massacres carried out by groups of people against other groups of people for reasons we can only guess at, but whose consequences are written in bone and ash. What had changed? Why were these settled farming communities, with their surplus food and sophisticated technologies, their elaborate rituals and complex social structures, turning weapons against each other in ways that mobile hunter-gatherers rarely had? The answer may lie not in any single cause, but in the accumulation of pressures that the settled life had created without anyone fully understanding their implications. Population growth was accelerating beyond anything human societies had previously experienced. Communities that had once numbered in the dozens now contained hundreds of individuals. Regions that had supported scattered bands of foragers now hosted dense networks of permanent settlements, each competing for access to the best land, the most reliable water sources, the choicest locations for trade and defence. The mathematics of settlement were unforgiving. Every successful community attracted more people, either through natural increase or immigration from less prosperous areas. But the amount of fertile land suitable for farming was limited, and the techniques for expanding agricultural productivity were still primitive. Eventually, inevitably, growth would outstrip resources, creating pressures that had to be resolved somehow. War provided one solution, though it was a solution that created as many problems as it solved. A successful raid could eliminate competitors, acquire additional territory, capture livestock and stored grain, even secure captives who could provide labour for the victorious community. But it also created enemies, sparked cycles of revenge, and established precedents for using violence to solve problems that might otherwise have been addressed through negotiation or cooperation. The very innovations that had made farming communities more prosperous also made them more vulnerable to attack. Stored grain could be seized or destroyed. Domesticated animals could be driven away. Houses and storage facilities could be burned. People who had invested everything in permanent settlements could not simply pack up and move when threatened, as their mobile ancestors had done. They had to stand and fight, or lose everything they had worked to build. But perhaps the most significant factor was psychological rather than material. The settled life had changed how people thought about themselves, their neighbours, and their relationship to the land in ways that made conflict more likely and more devastating when it occurred. Property had become sacred in ways that would have been incomprehensible to hunter-gatherers. The field that your grandfather had cleared, the house that your family had built and rebuilt over generations, the storage pit where your children's future security lay buried in grain, these were not just practical assets, but extensions of identity, repositories of memory, tangible connections to everything that made life meaningful. When someone threatened these possessions, they were not just threatening material welfare, but attacking the foundations of selfhood itself. The rage this provoked was deeper and more lasting than any conflict over temporary resources could have generated. It was the fury of people who felt that their very existence was being erased, their ancestors dishonoured, their children's inheritance stolen. The communities themselves had become more internally stratified, creating new sources of tension that could explode into violence under the right circumstances. The successful families with their larger houses and fuller storage pits, their finer clothing and more elaborate ornaments, had developed lifestyles that distinguished them sharply from their less fortunate neighbours. These inequalities were still modest by later standards, but they represented a fundamental break with the egalitarian traditions that had governed human societies since the emergence of our species. For the first time, some people had much more than others, and those differences were becoming permanent, heritable, justified by ideologies that made them seem natural and inevitable. The poor had reasons to resent the rich, and the rich had reasons to fear the poor. Trust between social classes began to erode as interests diverged and opportunities became unequally distributed. Communities that had once been united by shared challenges and mutual dependence began to fracture along lines of wealth, status, and access to resources. Leadership itself had become a source of conflict. The informal situational authority that characterized hunter-gatherer bands had evolved into more permanent positions of power that carried real privileges and responsibilities. Someone had to decide when to plant and when to harvest, how to distribute stored food during lean periods, whether to trade with neighbouring communities or prepare for war against them. These decisions affected everyone, but were increasingly made by small groups of influential families who had the most to gain or lose from particular choices. The rest of the community found themselves subject to authority they had not chosen and could not easily challenge, following strategies they might not agree with, bearing costs for decisions that primarily benefited others. Religious beliefs had evolved to support these new power structures, but they had also created new sources of division and conflict. Different communities developed different relationships with the spirits they believed controlled their fate. Some claimed special knowledge about proper rituals, others possessed sacred objects, or maintained shrines that attracted pilgrims from distant areas. These religious differences could become pretexts for conflict when combined with competition over material resources. A community that worshipped the wrong spirits, or worshipped the right spirits in the wrong way, could be seen as dangerous to the cosmic order that kept the rains falling and the crops growing. Destroying such communities might be not just profitable, but spiritually necessary. The scale of human organisation had expanded beyond the limits of personal relationships and face-to-face accountability. In hunter-gatherer bands, everyone knew everyone else intimately. Violence between community members was constrained by the knowledge that you would have to live with the consequences of your actions for the rest of your life, that hurting someone else would damage relationships you depended on for survival. But farming communities now included hundreds of people, many of whom were strangers to each other, despite living in the same settlement. It became possible to harm others without destroying your own social networks, to pursue narrow interests without considering their effects on the community as a whole. The anonymity that came with larger populations also made it easier to dehumanize enemies, to see them not as individuals with their own hopes and fears, but as obstacles to be removed or resources to be exploited. When you didn't know the people you were fighting, when they lived far enough away that their suffering wouldn't be visible in your daily life, violence became more psychologically tolerable. Trade networks that connected communities across vast distances also connected their conflicts. A dispute over grazing rights in one valley could escalate into a regional war as allies were drawn in. Obligations were called upon, and grievances spread along the same routes that carried obsidian, shells, and grain. The technologies that had made farming more productive also made warfare more devastating. Metal tools that could clear forests and shape stone could also penetrate human flesh more efficiently than their wooden and flint predecessors. Techniques developed for managing domesticated animals could be adapted to control human captives. Organisational skills honed in coordinating agricultural labour could be applied to military campaigns. But perhaps most importantly, the very success of the farming experiment had created expectations that made any setback feel catastrophic. People who had grown up expecting steady improvement, who had been taught that hard work and proper behaviour would be rewarded with prosperity, were psychologically unprepared for the reversals that inevitably came with climate fluctuations, crop failures, or simple bad luck. When harvests failed, or animals died, or stored grain rotted, communities looked for someone to blame. If the problem couldn't be attributed to natural causes, then it must be the result of human malice. Neighbours who had stolen resources, enemies who had cursed the crops, spirits who had been offended by improper behaviour. These explanations provided both emotional satisfaction and practical direction for action. Instead of accepting losses as unavoidable consequences of living in an uncertain world, communities could channel their frustration into violence against those they held responsible for their suffering. The cycle became self-perpetuating. Violence created more violence as communities that had been attacked sought revenge, as successful raiders attracted imitators, as the knowledge and techniques of warfare spread along with stories of its effectiveness in solving problems that had once seemed intractable. Children growing up in this environment learned to see conflict as normal, even necessary. They heard stories of heroic warriors and successful campaigns, absorbed lessons about the importance of strength and the dangers of showing weakness, internalized beliefs about the fundamental hostility of other groups and the need for constant vigilance against attack. The psychological transformation was as profound as any material change. People were becoming capable of organized, systematic violence against other human beings in ways that would have been virtually impossible for their hunter-gatherer ancestors. They were developing institutions, ideologies, and technologies specifically designed for harming other people, and these innovations were spreading as rapidly as agricultural techniques themselves. But the violence was not constant or universal. Many communities managed to avoid serious conflicts for centuries, developing diplomatic solutions to disputes, building trading relationships that made war economically counterproductive, creating alliances that provided security through cooperation rather than conquest. The archaeological record preserves evidence of both warfare and peace, of communities that thrived through trade and others that expanded through conquest, of innovations in both military technology and conflict resolution. The settled life created possibilities for both the cooperation and conflict on scales that had never existed before. What had been lost, however, was the option of simply walking away from problems that couldn't be solved through negotiation or compromise. Hunter-gatherers who couldn't get along with their neighbours could join different bands or move to different territories. Farmers who had invested everything in permanent settlements had to find other ways to resolve disputes, and sometimes those ways involved violence on a scale that their mobile ancestors could never have imagined or sustained. The bones in the Syrian dust represent more than individual tragedies. They mark a threshold in human history, the point at which our species became capable of systematic warfare, organised oppression, the deliberate destruction of entire communities in pursuit of resources, territory, or simply the elimination of perceived threats. This capability would prove to be one of our most persistent and destructive inheritances from the agricultural revolution. Every civilization that followed would struggle with the same basic problem: how to organize large numbers of people in permanent settlements without creating the conditions that made large-scale violence inevitable. Some would succeed for centuries or even millennia, building sophisticated systems of law, diplomacy, and conflict resolution that channeled human aggression into less destructive forms. Others would collapse quickly into cycles of warfare that consumed the very prosperity they were meant to protect. But none would entirely escape the fundamental tension between the human need for security and the human capacity for violence, between the benefits of living together in large, complex societies and the costs of managing the conflicts that such societies inevitably generate. The great experiment continued, but its innocence was lost forever. People had discovered not just how to grow food and domesticate animals and build permanent shelters, but how to kill each other systematically, efficiently, for reasons that went far beyond immediate survival needs. The harvest was still abundant, but it was now watered with blood as well as rain. The seeds that had been planted in hope and hunger had grown into forests so dense and dark that their cultivators could no longer see the sky that had once guided their ancestors across landscapes of infinite possibility. In the silence that followed those ancient massacres, in the emptiness of settlements abandoned to ash and bone, a question echoed that would never be fully answered. Had we gained more than we had lost? Had the security and abundance of the settled life been worth the price we were beginning to pay in violence, inequality, and alienation from the natural world that had shaped us? The question would be asked again and again throughout human history, in different languages and different contexts, but always with the same underlying urgency. Because once we had tasted the fruits of civilization, once we had built the systems that could produce such abundance and such destruction, there could be no going back to the simpler world we had left behind. We could only move forward, carrying both the gifts and burdens of our ancestors' choices, trying to find ways to preserve what was best about their innovations while avoiding the worst of their unintended consequences. The story was far from over, but its fundamental character had been established. We were no longer just another species of hunter-gatherer, perfectly adapted to the world that evolution had given us. We had become something else entirely, builders of civilizations, shapers of environments, masters and victims of systems so complex that no individual could fully understand them, trapped by our own success in cages of our own making, still dreaming of the freedom our ancestors had known but could no longer remember how to achieve. The transformation was complete, but the reckoning had only just begun. And so we find ourselves, 10,000 years later, carrying the weight of that ancient choice in every smartphone notification, every mortgage payment, every anxious glance at the stock market. The DNA of those first farmers runs through our veins, but so does the restless gene of the hunter-gatherer, the part of us that still dreams of horizons unmarked by fences, of time measured not in deadlines, but in seasons of communities small enough that every face tells a story you know by heart. We are the inheritors of both the greatest success and the most profound mistake in human history. The cities that tower around us, the technologies that connect us across impossible distances, the medical knowledge that extends our lives far beyond what our ancestors could have imagined. All of this flows from that first decision to stay put, to plant seeds, to believe that tomorrow could be controlled rather than simply survived. But so too does the anxiety that gnaws at us in the small hours of the morning, the sense that something essential has been lost in all our gaining, the depression that settles like fog over societies that have everything they thought they wanted, but somehow feel emptier than their ancestors, who owned nothing but their knowledge and their relationships. The environmental destruction that we know is happening, but feel powerless to stop, locked as we are into systems that demand growth even when growth has become destruction. Perhaps the most profound irony is that farming, which began as a solution to uncertainty, has created new forms of uncertainty that dwarf anything our hunter-gatherer ancestors faced. They worried about the weather, about finding food, about conflicts with neighbouring bands. We worry about global climate change, about economic collapse, about nuclear war, about artificial intelligence, about pandemics, about the collapse of democratic institutions, about the death of the oceans, about the extinction of species we've never even discovered. Their uncertainties were local, immediate, manageable through knowledge and cooperation, and when necessary, movement. Ours are global, systemic, seemingly beyond the reach of any individual action or even any single nation's policy. We have gained the power to reshape the planet itself, but we seem to have lost the wisdom to know when to stop. The hunter-gatherer lived in the eternal present, responding to each moment as it arose with the full toolkit of skills and relationships they had inherited from countless generations of successful survivors. We live suspended between a past we can barely remember and a future we can hardly bear to imagine, carrying the accumulated weight of 10,000 years, of choices made by people who could not have foreseen their consequences. But perhaps there is something to be learned from understanding how we got here, from tracing the slow transformation that turned wanderers into settlers, foragers into farmers, free people into citizens of systems they no longer fully control. Because if the cage we live in was built by human choices, then perhaps it can be modified by human choices as well. Not dismantled. That door closed long ago. The knowledge needed for the hunter-gatherer life has been largely forgotten. The landscapes that supported it have been transformed beyond recognition. The population of the planet has grown far beyond what hunting and gathering could sustain. We cannot go back, even if we wanted to, but we might be able to go forward differently, to build systems that honour both our need for security and our longing for freedom, to create technologies that enhance human flourishing rather than diminishing it, to organise societies that provide abundance without destroying the environment that sustains all life, to find ways of living together that acknowledge both our individual worth and our deep interdependence. The story of agriculture is not a morality tale with a clear hero and villain. It is a human story, full of unintended consequences and impossible choices, of people trying to build better lives for their children, and sometimes succeeding in ways that created new problems for their grandchildren. It is our story, the story of how we became who we are, for better and for worse. And like all human stories, it is still being written. The seeds planted 10,000 years ago have grown into a forest so vast we can barely see its edges, but we are still its gardeners, still responsible for tending what grows in the clearings we create. The harvest is not yet complete, and perhaps it never will be. The question that echoes across the millennia remains as urgent today as it was in those first experimental villages. How do we live well together on this planet that gave us birth? How do we balance our individual needs with our collective welfare? How do we provide security without sacrificing freedom, abundance without destroying sustainability, progress without losing our essential humanity? These are not questions with easy answers, but they are questions worth asking. Questions that honour both the courage of our ancestors, who chose the uncertain path of settlement, and the wisdom of those who understood that every choice carries both gifts and shadows into the future. We are the children of farmers and the grandchildren of hunter-gatherers. We carry both legacies in our bones, both possibilities in our imagination. The great experiment that began with a handful of wild grain continues in every choice we make about how to organise our communities, how to relate to the natural world, how to pass on what we have learned to those who will inherit the consequences of our decisions. The seeds are still being planted, the harvest is still to come. And in that continuing story, in that ongoing negotiation between what we were and what we might become, lies perhaps our greatest hope. That we might yet learn to be worthy of both the freedom we inherited and the responsibility we cannot escape. The sun sets now over cities instead of camps, over fields instead of forests, over a world so transformed that those first farmers would barely recognise it as the same planet they called home. But the same sun that watched them make their first, uncertain experiments with settlement and cultivation still watches us make our own uncertain experiments with how to live wisely in the world they helped to create. And in that continuity, in that long conversation between past and future, we might yet find the wisdom to write the next chapter of the human story with greater awareness of both its possibilities and its perils. The great mistake, if it was a mistake, has been made. The great achievement, if it was an achievement, has been accomplished. What remains is the even greater challenge of learning to live well with the consequences of both. Thank you for walking this long path through time with me, for sitting with the complexity of our inheritance, for holding both the wonder and the sorrow of what it means to be human in a world we have so profoundly shaped. If this helped you think differently about the ground beneath your feet, the food on your table, or the strange trajectory that brought our species from small bands of wanderers to the architects of global civilization, then perhaps these ancient voices have served their purpose. If you found this journey through deep time helpful, whether it carried you towards sleep, gave you something to ponder during a quiet walk, or simply offered a moment of stillness in a restless world, consider sharing it with someone who might need to hear these ancient echoes. Leave a like if these stories matter to you. Subscribe if you'd like to explore more forgotten chapters of our shared past, and tell us in the comments where you're listening from and how these tales find their way into your life. Are you curled up in a library corner in London, walking through rain-soaked streets in Seattle, or lying awake in a small apartment in Tokyo, wondering how we got from there to here? Your presence in this moment, listening to these whispers from the deep past, is part of the continuing story. The timestamps are waiting in the description below, ready to guide you back to wherever sleep or distraction carried you away. Because some stories are worth returning to, worth sitting with until their full weight settles into understanding. But before we close this particular chapter, there's one more thread to follow, one more question that haunts the empty spaces between what we gained and what we lost. Because the story of farming isn't just about food or villages or the birth of civilization. It's about something more intimate, more immediate, more present in every breath you take as you listen to these words. It's about what happened to the human body itself. Your spine, curved now from sitting at desks and staring at screens, carries the memory of ancestors who walked upright across endless landscapes, whose backs were straight from a lifetime of varied movement. Your teeth, cleaned with fluoride and straightened with metal, evolved to process the tough, fibrous plants and occasional meat of the hunter-gatherer diet, not the soft, processed foods that now make up most of our meals. Your eyes, designed to track movement across vast distances, to read the subtle signs of weather in cloud formations, to distinguish edible plants from poisonous ones at a glance, now strained to focus on tiny symbols on glowing rectangles just inches from your face, your feet, shaped by millions of years of walking on uneven ground, now live confined in shoes on flat surfaces, their intricate architecture slowly forgetting how to grip earth and stone. But perhaps most profoundly, your nervous system, that ancient network of chemical signals and electrical impulses that kept your ancestors alive in a world full of predators and possibilities, still operates as if that world existed. It floods your bloodstream with stress hormones when your phone buzzes, treats a difficult email like a charging lion, responds to social media criticism as if your very survival depended on the approval of the tribe. This is the most intimate inheritance of the agricultural revolution. Not just the world we built, but the bodies we built it with. Bodies still calibrated for a life that no longer exists. We are Paleolithic hunters and gatherers trying to make sense of a Neolithic world with post-industrial problems, and the mismatch shows in every aspect of modern life. The anxiety that keeps you awake at night, scrolling through news of distant disasters you cannot influence or prevent, is the same hypervigilance that once kept your ancestors alive when every shadow might hide a predator. The depression that settles over entire populations, despite unprecedented material prosperity, is perhaps the grief response of creatures designed for intimate community, for work that felt meaningful, for connection to the living world. The restlessness that drives us to constantly seek more experiences, more possessions, more stimulation, might be the echo of the nomadic instinct. The part of us that knows, deep in our bones, that stopping in one place for too long meant stagnation, meant missing the seasonal abundance that lay just over the next hill. Even our relationship with time bears the scars of this ancient transition. The hunter-gatherer lived in what psychologists now call flow states, moments of complete absorption in immediate experience, where the self dissolves into pure awareness of the present moment. This was not a luxury for them, but a necessity, because survival depended on being fully present to whatever was happening right now. We, by contrast, live scattered across time, worrying about futures we cannot control, ruminating about pasts we cannot change, rarely fully present to the only moment we actually have. Our calendars and clocks, descendants of the first agricultural scheduling systems, have trained us to experience time as a scarce resource to be managed rather than a flowing river to be navigated. But here's what's remarkable. Even after 10,000 years of settled life, even after centuries of industrialization and decades of digitization, the ancient patterns still pulse beneath the surface. In quiet moments, walking in a forest, sitting by a fire, sharing a meal with people we love, something primordial awakens. The nervous system calms, the breathing deepens, the mind settles into rhythms that feel both foreign and familiar. This is not nostalgia speaking, but neurobiology, the brain structures that enabled our ancestors to thrive in small mobile communities are still there, still active, still shaping how we process experience. The capacities for deep attention, for reading subtle social cues, for finding meaning in natural patterns, these haven't disappeared. They've just been overlaid with newer systems, like ancient paths that still run beneath modern highways. Perhaps this is why certain experiences feel so immediately restorative. Gardening with our hands in soil, walking without destination, sitting in silence with others, preparing food from basic ingredients, watching fire or water or sky. These activities don't just relax us, they reconnect us to ways of being that are written into our deepest architecture. The tragedy is not that we chose farming over hunting and gathering. The tragedy is that in building our new world, we forgot to honour what we carried forward from the old one. We created systems that treat the human need for community, for meaningful work, for connection to nature, for varied movement, for quiet contemplation, as luxuries rather than necessities. But perhaps understanding this inheritance, both its gifts and its burdens, offers us a way forward. Not backward to a life that no longer exists, but forward to forms of civilization that work with human nature rather than against it. Cities designed for walking as well as driving, work that engages our whole selves rather than just our abstract reasoning. Technologies that enhance human connection rather than replacing it. Educational systems that cultivate wisdom alongside information. The path ahead requires neither rejecting the achievements of the settled life, nor accepting all of its costs as inevitable. It requires the same quality of attention our ancestors brought to reading landscapes and weather patterns, applied now to reading the landscape of our own experience, our own needs, our own possibilities. The seeds planted so long ago have grown into a world beyond anything those first farmers could have imagined. But we are still the gardeners, still responsible for what grows in the clearings we create. The harvest is not yet complete, and perhaps that's the most hopeful thing of all. Because if the story is still being written, if the experiment is still unfolding, then our choices still matter. Every moment of presence we cultivate, every act of genuine connection we create, every system we redesign to honour rather than ignore our deepest nature. These are all ways of tending the ancient seeds, of ensuring that what grows serves not just our survival, but our flourishing. The question our ancestors faced, how to live well in an uncertain world, remains our question too. The answers they found created new questions for us to face. The answers we find will create new questions for our descendants. This is not a problem to be solved, but a conversation to be continued, a dance between constraint and possibility that defines what it means to be human. In the end, perhaps the greatest mistake would be to think the story is finished, that the patterns established 10,000 years ago are unchangeable, that we are prisoners rather than participants in the great experiment of human civilization. We are not. We are the children of wanderers who learn to stay put, of foragers who learn to plant, of communities that learn to build. We carry their courage in our blood and their wisdom in our bones. And if we listen carefully enough to both the ancient voices and the emerging ones, we might yet learn to build a world worthy of the best of what we've inherited and the best of what we might become. The story continues. The seeds are still sprouting. The harvest waits to be gathered by hands that remember both how to hold and how to let go. And in that balance between holding and releasing, between staying and going, between honouring the past and embracing the future, lies perhaps our only hope of finding our way home. To ourselves, to each other, and to the planet that gave birth to both our wandering and our settling, our mistakes and our dreams. Thank you for listening. Thank you for wondering. Thank you for carrying these ancient questions into whatever comes next. Stay curious, stay present, and remember, you are both the descendant of the past and the ancestor of the future. How you tend that inheritance matters more than you know. Sweet dreams, fellow sapiens. The story continues tomorrow.